In late November 2022, the United States issued calls for calm as Turkey seemed poised to launch a ground invasion of northern Syria, coming soon after a major terrorist attack in Istanbul that Ankara blamed on Syrian Kurdish groups. The rising tensions again underscore the long-standing conflict between Turkey and the Kurds. So what exactly is their dispute all about? And why are the United States and other Western countries so concerned about the prospect of another Turkish offensive against Kurdish groups in northern Syria? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Around the world, there are numerous insurgencies. In some cases, these are relatively small, localized and low-level affairs. However, sometimes they've escalated into large-scale, prolonged conflicts that have drawn in neighbouring countries. One of the most significant examples is the long-running conflict between Turkey and the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK. Over the course of almost 40 years, this conflict has spread well beyond its original heartlands in the southeast of Turkey and into the main cities of the country. But it's also had an international dimension. While Turkey has long been engaged against Kurdish forces in northern Iraq, this has now extended into neighbouring Syria. And it looks set to escalate again. So what exactly is the issue all about? Numbering around 25 to 30 million people, the Kurds are believed to have originated in the Taurus and Zagros mountains that stretch in an arc across what is today southeast Turkey, northern Iraq and northwest Iran. Speaking an Indo-European language related to Persian, the vast majority follow the Sunni branch of the Muslim faith. While the Kurds have a long history, our story really begins with the emergence of the Ottoman Empire in the 13th century. Having conquered the Anatolian Peninsula, it began to push up into the Balkans and across into the Middle East, conquering the traditional Kurdish areas. However, this came to an end after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was carved up by the European colonial powers. Under the terms of the 1920 Treaty of Sevres, while much of the Anatolian Peninsula would be divided between Greece, France and Armenia, a Turkish state would also be created. But as part of this, it was agreed that the Kurdish areas would be given the right to a referendum on independence within a year. In the end, though, the treaty never came into force as Turkish nationalist forces fought back under their leader Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. As a result, the plans to divide the peninsula were abandoned. Instead of getting their own homeland, the Kurds were instead now left divided between French-controlled Syria, British-controlled Iraq, Persia and the new Republic of Turkey. Having become what's sometimes been called the world's largest nation without an independent homeland, in the decades that followed, the Kurds staged several major uprisings, most notably in Iran and Iraq. However, the most significant rebellion emerged in Turkey in 1984, when a Marxist-oriented group, the PKK, launched an armed insurgency. Originally focused on creating a separate Kurdish state in the mountainous southeast, the heartland of the Kurds in Turkey, over the following decade, the conflict escalated dramatically. By the 1990s, the conflict had led to thousands of deaths and was increasingly drawing in neighbouring states. Most notably, the creation of an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq following the First Gulf War in 1991 had allowed the PKK to establish military bases close to the Turkish border. This in turn saw regular cross-border operations by Turkish forces. At the same time, tensions also grew with Syria, which was providing a haven for the PKK's leader, Abdullah Öcalan. This came to a head in 1998 when Turkey demanded that Damascus hand him over or face the threat of invasion. Rather than give him up, Syria instead expelled Öcalan, thus starting an odyssey that would eventually see the Kurdish leader arrested by Turkish special forces outside the Greek embassy in Kenya in early 1999. Following this, the conflict appeared to soften, at least for a bit. Öcalan was eventually found guilty of armed secession and leading a terrorist group, and although originally sentenced to death, this was later commuted to life imprisonment. Meanwhile, the PKK, which had now called a ceasefire, was increasingly marginalised. Having been designated a foreign terrorist organisation by the United States in 1997, it was also proscribed by Britain in 2001 and the EU in 2004. In addition, other signs of change started to emerge. In late 2002, Turkey elected a new government under the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. After years spent limiting Kurdish identity and rights and spurred by its quest to see Turkey join the European Union, the AKP began lifting some of the harshest restrictions imposed on the Kurds. This included the use of Kurdish language names and opening up opportunities for private Kurdish language schooling. Despite this, progress began to stall. In 2004, the PKK called off its ceasefire, and by the end of the decade, violence was rising again. In 2012, the Turkish government initiated a formal peace process by opening discussions with Öcalan and introducing further liberalisation. However, it proved short-lived. In 2015, the talks broke down after the PKK killed 2 policemen, and the government, which was planning snap elections, decided to resume the conflict. And it was at this point that developments in neighbouring Syria now entered the picture. In early 2011, popular protests erupted across the Middle East and North Africa, the so-called Arab Spring. Having started in Tunisia, by April they'd spread to Syria, where mass demonstrations broke out against the ruling administration of Bashar al-Assad. Within months, the country had descended into what would eventually become an extremely complex and multi-sided civil war. As Syrian government forces fought opposition in the south, the Kurdish areas in the north saw their opportunity to break free. This was led by the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, and its armed wing, the People's Protection Units, the YPG. As the group gained strength and aligned with other organisations, it eventually proclaimed the creation of a separate entity in the region, the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as Rojava. From the start, Turkey viewed all this with deep concern. Aside from fears about the implications of a new Kurdish-controlled area on its southern border, Ankara was also alarmed by the extremely close links between the PYD and the PKK. Indeed, Turkish officials and many outside observers argued that the PYD was in fact an offshoot of the Kurdish Workers' Party, although the PYD insists that it is in fact separate. But as unhappy as Turkey was with the situation, especially after the breakdown of the peace process in 2015, Ankara's ability to act was limited by another factor. As the civil war escalated, Syria had increasingly become a magnet for Islamist insurgents, including the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, otherwise known as ISIS, IS, or Daesh. Establishing a stronghold in the east, close to Iraq, it soon began to threaten Rojava. It was at this point that Washington and many other NATO members, fearful of the creation of an Islamist statelet, threw their support behind the Kurds. However, by 2019, and after several years of brutal fighting, IS had been defeated. As a result, and having already intervened elsewhere in northern Syria, Ankara now saw its chance to act in the northeast. In doing so, it not only wanted to limit Kurdish influence, it also hoped to create an area where it could repatriate large numbers of the estimated 3.5 million Syrian refugees who'd fled to Turkey during the civil war. In October 2019, Ankara got its chance. Following a conversation with Erdogan, US President Trump announced the withdrawal of American forces in northern Syria, much to the anger and dismay of many observers who saw it as a gross betrayal of the Kurds. Just days later, Turkey launched a full-scale invasion of northern Syria, Operation Spring Peace. The move had an immediate and dramatic effect. The PYD and their allies, collectively known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, now appealed to Russia and the Syrian government for support. At this point, Trump was forced to backtrack, sending an extraordinary letter to Erdogan in which he threatened to destroy the Turkish economy and called on the Turkish president not to be a tough guy. Ankara agreed to a ceasefire. In the end, the Turkish operation fell short of original expectations. While it had forced the SDF out of parts of the north, rather than establish the almost 500-kilometre long and 30-kilometre deep safe zone that it had wanted, the final area under Turkish control extended for around 115 kilometres or 75 miles. The invasion also had serious wider effects. As well as driving an estimated 300,000 people from their homes, it allowed many ISIS militants to escape as SDF forces were drawn into fighting the Turkish army. All this undermined Turkey's relations with its Western partners. As well as US sanctions, many EU members now introduced restrictions on arms sales to Turkey, as did Britain, which called the invasion reckless and counterproductive. So, what sparked these latest threats to invade again? First, it's worth noting that Erdogan has in fact been talking about this since May 2022. However, the immediate cause was a deadly bombing in Istanbul on the 13th of November that killed 6 people, pinning the blame on the YPG, even though the group insists that it wasn't responsible. Ankara immediately launched bombing and artillery raids on northern Syria in preparation for what Erdogan has said will be a land attack to neutralise the terrorists. But will Turkey actually invade? In truth, it's hard to say for certain. While officials close to the situation suggest that the Turkish government is resisting diplomatic engagement and have said for several weeks that a Turkish invasion could happen at any moment, it hasn't acted yet. In this sense, Ankara may well be considering its options, and it faces a very difficult choice. On the one hand, any action would again undermine relations with Turkey's Western partners. While ISIS may have been defeated, the broader Islamist threat remains. The United States and other NATO members want the ongoing alliance with the Kurds in order to keep this in check. Meanwhile, others will inevitably be worried about the humanitarian effects of any Turkish action. A further invasion could see many hundreds of thousands more people affected. All this explains the strong calls for restraint, including from the SDF, which has called on Washington to stop Turkey. On top of this, an attack could also raise tensions between Ankara and Moscow, which has also been calling for restraint against its Syrian ally, as has neighbouring Iran. On the other hand, for Turkey, there's clearly a sense of unfinished business. The 2019 invasion failed to secure its basic objectives, but there are other reasons to take the threat seriously. With Turkish presidential and parliamentary elections due to be held by the middle of 2023, Erdogan may want to reinforce his nationalist credentials. For all these reasons, while the prospect of another Turkish invasion is very real, the actual decision to act is not as straightforward as it may seem. But perhaps more to the point, regardless of what happens, the latest developments underscore just how deeply entrenched and far-reaching the long-standing battle between Turkey and the Kurds has become. But of course, this is far from the only issue that Turkey faces. Here's a playlist with other videos on Turkish foreign and security policy. Alternatively, here's another video that YouTube thinks you might find useful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.